What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It has already been done in the ages before us. That which is already has been. That which is to be already is. This quotation from two parts of Ecclesiastes is very eye-opening, but it goes on to be mentioned more in Nietzsche's writing, although not explicitly linked to the biblical corpus. In The Gay Science, in aphorism 341, Nietzsche says, "The eternal hourglass of existence is turned upside down again and again, and you with it, speck of dust." In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, it is said, "I come again with this sun, with this earth, with this eagle, with this snake, not to a new life or a better life or a similar life. I come again eternally to this identical and self-same life, in its greatest and its smallest, to teach again the eternal return of all things, to speak again the word of the great noon of earth and man, to proclaim the Übermensch to man again." All of these quotes go together to describe one idea, which has been called, at least today, the eternal recurrence of the same. This is something Nietzsche talked a lot about, but we can see it's not exclusive to Nietzsche. And it's the idea that everything is cyclically happening again and again. Maybe not precisely the same things, but it's kind of like in the prologue to Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where Zarathustra wakes up from his cave to the sun and talks about how great this eagle, this star is that rises every day and sets past the horizon and keeps going again and again in this cyclical nature. And this is an idea we see throughout Nietzsche's philosophy, which is that nature should be relied upon or appreciated because it really doesn't change. In a sense, it's dying and rebirth, and it's this cyclical pattern that keeps going. But this eternal recurrence of the same, Nietzsche wants to push even into human and social life, because of course Nietzsche believes that humans are definitely enmeshed in this biological world, not necessarily exceptional like might be implied by, for example, Genesis 2 or something like that. But this eternal recurrence of the same is restated in our daily lives in more benign and innocent ways. For example, we have the eternal recurrence of seemingly the same rhetoric from older generations. Whether it's how younger people are obsessed with their phones or really any sort of technology, or nobody wanting to work anymore, or any of these ideas, they seem to be a recurring thing that we see across time, not just today. But one of the most interesting and commonplace occurrences in terms of rhetoric we see is that today the world lacks meaning.
The topic of meaning and meaning in life.
Crisis of purpose and meaning today.
The meaning crisis. The crisis of meaning, or the God-shaped hole in the culture.
A crisis of meaning.
What is the nature of the meaning crisis in modern times?
That's what gives life meaning.
Now, Baudrillard is very concerned with how the media might increase information and how that could affect meaning. Baudrillard thinks that media is a very parasitic thing on meaning, and he sees this as a crisis. As we continue going into Baudrillard's philosophy, we're going to look at a specific essay from Simulacra and Simulation titled "The Implosion of Meaning in the Media," in which he talks about the relationship between information, signs, and meaning, and if meaning is even possible anymore in the face of his dreadful doubts about being able to find anything other than just the real anymore. Meaning, of course, has to have a distinction between the meaning or the meaningful and the not meaningful. And Baudrillard, if you watched the last video, you know he sees the differentiation between the real and the unreal to have collapsed. And as such, this does seem to be a true crisis of meaning. And all the time we see in media this sort of crisis of meaning being talked about. Today, we're going to see what Baudrillard has to say on that and see whether this will just make us sad or give us some food for thought as well. Now, we like to think that meaning has a formula. There's some way in which we can delineate between things which are meaningful and things which seem to appear so or simply aren't meaningful at all. Even if we like to think that this meaning is subjective, for example, what tastes good, or aesthetics in terms of art, or the value of a family heirloom, or any object of importance, such as a book like this that I've annotated very specifically to my means, we nevertheless like to think that we can at least get a ballpark estimate, a sort of theory of what is meaningful. And in some sense, this is the project of criticism more broadly today. I think of, for example, Adorno's aesthetic theory, where he is trying to talk about, of course, a theory of aesthetics, of what is beautiful and what isn't. All the time in today's world, we see mentionings of weird pieces of art, such as that one piece of art that shreds itself right after it's been bought.
No sooner did the gavel come down to mark the sale of Banksy's Girl with Balloon for a record $1.4 million, did the picture start to slip out of its frame into shreds below.
Or all sorts of other avant-garde art, whether that's Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, or whether that's any other piece of artwork, or whether it's some kind of political statement, like the throwing of tomato soup on artworks.
What is worth more, art or life?
All of this goes together to either create meaning or create meaning precisely by going against something meaningful or something that is masquerading as having meaning. So meaning has a lot of value in our lives, and in the realm of aesthetics and how we like to talk about meaning, there's a sort of process that we've come to understand, or at least that Baudrillard talks about, that might lead us to meaning. Now, most of us think that meaning is linked to information. For example, this book in my hand has some meaning to me, and I assume that this meaning is somehow tied to the book and the information that has been given to me through the book. Now, the information in this book lays here seemingly barely, and the question is, how do I apprehend this? And this is not necessarily a purely epistemic question, but Baudrillard says that meaning is gathered when information is linked to us via signs. And if you watch the last video on Baudrillard, you know that the signs is sort of an eternal recurrence of its own. Baudrillard thinks that we've mistaked the real for the signs of the real, and that now all we have is this interplay of signs going on. So, getting back to what we were talking about, Baudrillard thinks that information is given to us via signs, which operate on that information to yield some kind of meaning. Now, Baudrillard starts off by giving us 3 hypotheses of meaning. It's all about the role that information has to meaning and which of these we should consider. And in a sense, he's trying to straw man these 3 arguments to the best of our abilities. And he casts quite a wide net. Now, the third one, which we will get to, is the one that Baudrillard is the most privy to. But we must take a look at all 3 of them so that we can see the domain of possibilities that we can draw from. For the first hypothesis, he says, either information produces meaning, a negentropic factor, but cannot make up for the brutal loss of signification in every domain. Despite efforts to re-inject message and content, meaning is lost and devoured faster than it can be re-injected. In this case, one must appeal to a base productivity to replace failing media. This is the whole ideology of free speech, of media broken down into innumerable individual cells of transmission, that is, into anti-media, pirate radio, etc. So, in this sense, meaning is linked to information, but the problem is that we have so much information that even though we've created this meaning, we in a sense have a surplus of meaning and information, and this is the ideology of coming back to the basics. For example, he talks about pirate radio, or you could think of this as like grassroots organizations or something like this, that tries to cut through the kerfuffle of the modern age and tries to get back to the simple ways and the ways things used to be, to try to get some kind of meaning from the way things used to be. For our second hypothesis, he says, or information has nothing to do with signification. It is something else, an operational model of another order, outside meaning and of the circulation of meaning strictly speaking. This is Shannon's hypothesis, a sphere of information that is purely functional, a technical medium that does not imply any finality of meaning, and thus should also not be implicated in a value judgment. A kind of code, like the genetic code. It is what it is. It functions as it does. Meaning is something else that, in a sense, comes from after the fact, as it does for monad in chance and necessity. In this case, there would simply be no significant relation between the inflation of information and the deflation of meaning. So here there's the idea that information has nothing to do with signification, that in a sense we can barely apprehend an object. For example, I can look at this book and ascribe no value judgment or any meaning judgment of any kind and merely find myself with bare facts, and then I can come upon meaning later after seeing the object in its bare functionality. I, on the other hand, and I'm sure Baudrillard thinks this too, although he doesn't speak too specifically to the second hypothesis going later into the essay, but I think this is a bit naive. I think if, for example, you look at Heidegger wants to stress the fact that Dasein is within the world, that it is in der Weltsein, in the world being, or being in the world, and that any meaning we could associate with the world is linked to the fact that we can't just step back from the world and see it from a bird's eye view necessarily. And I think considering the fact that Baudrillard doesn't really go on to talk about this much implies that he doesn't find a lot of meaning behind this talk about meaning, and that he kind of sees it as something naive, just as I do. For the third hypothesis, and the one that he's most interested in, he says, or, very much on the contrary, there is a rigorous and necessary correlation between the two, to the extent that information is directly destructive of meaning and signification, or that it neutralizes them. The loss of meaning is directly linked to the dissolving, dissuasive action of information, the media, and the mass media. Now, Baudrillard is especially interested in this third hypothesis because the way he sees it, the media is merely a symptom of a larger societal problem, which is that we like to simply flood the channels, so to speak, with information, and this really muddies the waters. Of course, if you listened at all to the first lecture I did on this about the hyperreal and the simulacra versus the simulation versus the real, of course, the problem is that all we have now is the simulacrum. We live in a mode of desire and production and consumption. And for example, you see this in America when you see those pictures of consumerism where there's just stores everywhere, because consumption is, in a sense, part of our lives. You know, we place a certain emphasis on food. There's this funny ad that I saw, which was all about, I think it was like HelloFresh or something, and it was romanticizing and glorifying the idea that food, or specifically dinner, is something that allows you to relax from the work life and get back in touch with yourself. So in a sense, even when we leave work, we're still producing and consuming. We're still producing food and we're still consuming it, and we're interested in consumption wherever it lies, even in dinner. And as such, this is something that society at large preys upon. and it's not necessarily institutionally from the top down. Baudrillard kind of points out throughout Simulacra and Simulation that this is everywhere. This is the societal problem that we want. And I can't remember what essay it is, but I do want to do a video on that one where he does talk a lot about the way that society kind of adds to this problem by feeding back into it. In a sense, we know we're living in a myth of some kind. He actually says, "Myth exists, but one must guard against thinking that people believe in it. This is the trap of critical thinking that can be only exercised if it presupposes the naivete and stupidity of the masses." So, of course, this is the idea that we're both attached to our situation and aware that we're consuming and doing all this stuff and so involved in this discourse of information and this flooding of information, but we also kind of try to act a little bit childlike. And of course, he talks about kind of being a child and how we like to pretend like we're children in society sometimes later in this essay. But the flooding of information is very important to Baudrillard because he says, rather than creating communication, it exhausts itself in this act of staging communication. And this is kind of interesting because it's a sort of all-encompassing idea that we're involved in a false discourse, that information is being put out there, but actually more information or more care is taken to make sure that that information is tailored to exactly to our needs. Take, for example, like the YouTube algorithm. There's so much information, but there's an equally strong incentive, especially for YouTube, to try to pump out to you the most important videos to you, and not necessarily to give you the most meaningful content, but to give you exactly what you want. So in a sense, we are fully aware of our desire to consume, yet we nevertheless partake in it and almost pretend like it's a myth that we are some sort of free entities, for example, roaming YouTube, and that your algorithm didn't stumble upon this. And in a sense, this is an eternal recurrence itself, which he kind of talks about. I call it the eternal recurrence of signs, and this is kind of the confusing of the real for the signs of the real, but he talks about it as a perfectly descriptive machine that offers all the signs of the real and short circuits all its vicissitudes. So we have to realize that the real problem in this, like I mentioned before, is that Baudrillard thinks that the distinction between the real and the unreal has collapsed because we don't have any outside reference to tell us what is real and what is not. In a sense, if you live in this constant cycle of consumption and production and desire, in a sense, this is all you know. Everything is merely real and everything is part of this sort of pathology. And in the same sense, meaning requires a distinction between that which is meaningful and that which merely seems to be meaningful or it isn't actually meaningful at all. And we can see the problem if we think that this distinction between the real and the unreal has sort of just devolved. He kind of puts this in a larger context that feels a bit like Foucault to me. Foucault talks a lot about the idea that, knowledge is structured by this sort of enveloping political or social discourse, and that, for example, what it means to be sane versus insane. He talks about this when, he's talking about the history of mental asylums and the idea that people are locked up for certain things that kind of vary across time. And of course, there's this idea in Foucault that there's this larger structure that's pushing us down. It's very leftist in its essence. And there's this idea that, maybe we could get out of this penality, this kind of being controlled by a medium, and that we could get outside of that and have some sort of meaning. Now, he doesn't exactly express his project quite like that, but he does think that it's important to get out of the idea of, for example, punishment. He's very critical of punishment because he thinks that it takes certain people and disenfranchises them without merit or without ground for doing so. Now, Baudrillard is a bit more pessimistic than that. He says that the medium is the message, and he goes on to say more specifically, only the medium can make an event, whatever the contents, whether they are conformist or subversive. And this is interesting because, in a sense, the political, the social, the economic, all of these are creating a backdrop or a medium by which the stage of life plays on. For example, if you live in America, you live, within America, but also in front of America. This is always the backdrop to your actions. Certain revolutionary actions might mean one thing in one country and mean another thing in a different country. For example, the Capitol riots might mean a particular thing for America, but mean something completely different for France. For France, it might be some sort of pseudo-revolution that has no connection to their idea of revolution, but to America and to the American people, especially the ones that participated in the Capitol riot. It might be something deeply American. So, in a sense, the medium is the message in the sense that the medium is what creates our meaning. The medium, or the overarching structure, is the only thing that gives meaning of any kind. But the problem is, it's kind of in the same way that Baudrillard talks about the hyper-real. There is no real or unreal. In fact, there is only real. There is no unreal anymore. There is only what is present to us and that's given to us in this sort of eternal recurrence of signs in the daily life that we live. And as such, the only way we have meaning of any kind is through a medium. And in a sense, it's very socially constructionist because all there is meaning within a larger discourse. And this can kind of stage against or for us to give us false meaning. But of course, Baudrillard wouldn't say that it's false meaning necessarily. He would just lament the fact that this is the only way that we can get meaning of any kind anymore. In a sense, meaning is already pre-packaged for us. For example, if you are a leftist, or if you are a social democrat, or if you are a libertarian, you exist in a sort of political discourse. You identify with a certain party and with a certain set of ideals and a certain way that that party acts. For example, if you are a leftist, you aren't necessarily just a leftist because of those values, but also the way leftists act. And if you're part of the Muslim Brotherhood, you are part of the Muslim Brotherhood not only because they bolster Islam, but because they represent a certain set of values and a way of revolting and a way of acting that resonates with you. So, in a sense, you always are underneath. In this sense, we're speaking just in the political spectrum, but you exist underneath a structure that is determining the way that certain things are meaningful. For example, if you are very Republican or just very right-leaning in general, anytime there is certain acts that those on the left would call increasing tolerance or acceptance, you would not necessarily see this as an increase of tolerance or acceptance, even if maybe necessarily it aligned with your values of increasing personal freedom. For example, on abortion, those on the left, or those who are just pro-choice in general, would say that this is an increase in freedom. And of course, freedom is a very big talking point for those on the right, generally speaking. Yet, it's not quite this simple as aligning with values. There's a sense in which certain actions outside of their utility in the political sense have been pre-packaged for how you're supposed to respond to them. And in this sense, the meaning of an action is already made for you, and you're kind of just like a child bumbling your way through political or social or economic or personal life, and the meaning has not been manufactured by you, but manufactured by a larger substructure that even if you try to get outside of, you would just be going into another substructure. Even if you wanted to become a monk and go into the wilderness deep in Bhutan or something and meditate all the time, you just be within this structure of nature. And of course you have certain understandings of nature being calm and submissive to our needs and desires, and you're simply you've been socially conditioned into a certain understanding of all these things, and whenever you function within them, you have a certain way which meaning has been prepackaged already for you. Now, this may seem like both I and Baudrillard are being a bit too conformist, that all actions are within this structure and there's no sense of getting out, because of course no matter what side of the political or social landscape you lie within, if you're presented with something where some author is telling you you're trapped in something, your instinct is to try to get out of that and to liberate yourself. And Baudrillard, is not saying that you can get outside of this, just like he's saying you can't get out of the hyperreal. You simply always have the hyperreal. Even acts of revolution are kind of subsumed under that medium of discourse. Even things that are revolutionary are only allowed to be revolutionary on that system's terms. For example, by voting, producing, deciding, speaking, participating, playing the game, a form of blackmail and ultimatum just as serious as the other, even more serious today. So in a sense, this is some extreme pessimism in the sense that, for example, voting has a certain meaning. It has a certain meaning for people in terms of being able to change the political discourse. But how much of us can look at the political climate in, for example, say the US right now, and say that things have meaningfully changed in the last 20, 30, 40 years? Certainly many of us would say that we've had a lot of bad presidents. You might look at Obama and Trump and Biden and Clinton or all these other people, and you might say, all these guys are just a bunch of trash. If we go back to Eisenhower, if we go back to Roosevelt or something like that, those were the good days when we had real presidents, when we had real revolution and meaning. If we went back to 1776, the way things, it's this idea that we're simply in a phony scenario, and the idea is that voting can get us out of this. And this is, in a sense, what we are told when we're told to go out and vote, that we can make some kind of change. And, me personally, I'm not going to say just categorically that voting has no power. But, for example, in the US's two-party system, voting for a third party is an abysmal situation today. There's very, very little hope that a third party would ever win a presidential election. For example, we had a fairly thriving socialist party in the early 20th century, but it was blotted out by the larger political discourse that we see today that's very anti-socialist, at least on the face of it. And it's almost a commonplace saying at this point, especially among left-leaning people, to say that the Democrats and the Republicans are both Republicans, or they're both right-leaning. And obviously I think that's true, and many others, but you might not. But nevertheless, there's this idea that we have two opposing parties fighting for very different values, and that your voting power has a lot of power. But of course, you can only really vote for this party or another. There's the option always to vote for another candidate, but it's illusory. It's a power that, some might say that it's only a power in principle, that, for example, voting in a third-party candidate, this is the great conundrum of the two-party voting system, is do you go for the lesser of two evils and vote for a Democrat if you're a socialist and you don't necessarily align with the Democrats, but you align with the Republican Party even less, the question is, and the great dilemma is, do you vote for and stay within that two-party system, or do you break out knowing that your subversion of the two-party system isn't really plausibly going to go anywhere? And if you're a libertarian, do you vote for the Republican Party, realizing that, the Republican Party isn't necessarily a small government party, or, knowing that you don't agree with the Republicans, but you disagree with the Democrats even more? Or do you vote for the Libertarian Party knowing that realistically it's not going to be voted in, at least right now? And that's the catch, is that maybe in the future we will be able to break out of this. And this is the sort of superfluous power of voting. And this is what Baudrillard is trying to say, which is that this is all some form of blackmail and ultimatum, as he calls it. It's a way to try to get out of things, and it's really, as he calls it, a refusal of meaning by saturating the discourse with meaning that's just subsumed under a larger political or social edifice that you can't really get out of without getting to another one. It might as well be real and true power through voting or through speaking out or kind of playing the game, as he says, but it might as well be the hyper real too, at least in Baudrillard's sense of the word. And he gives us such a interesting and profound way of saying this when he says, the current argument of the system is to maximize speech, the maximum production of meaning. Thus, the strategic resistance is that of the refusal of meaning and of the spoken word, or of the hyper-conformist simulation of the very mechanisms of the system, which is a form of refusal and of non-reception. And of course, the idea is that the system isn't genuinely receptive to change, but it rather gives a sort of superfluous change, such as the idea that you can vote for something other than the two-party system in America. So, in conclusion, Baudrillard is giving us a very pessimistic understanding of meaning in the modern day, especially within media. And this doesn't necessarily need to be social media. This could also be religious gatherings, or this could be the media of the family dynamic or anything like that. There's a sort of oversaturation of meaning. And he says, quote, because the medium and the real are now in a single nebula whose truth is indecipherable. And this is the real heavy-hitting part of Baudrillard's philosophy, is that it's almost seemingly hopeless. But it does give us a lot of insight into these phenomena, and it does kind of widen our consciousness, so to speak. And even that, he's not really fond of consciousness raising, but it does kind of widen and raise our consciousness to how we're functioning in a social order. And in a sense, it does give real credence to the idea that maybe today does lack meaning. But in a sense, we've gone beyond the simply commonplace way that, the boomers might talk about there being a lack of meaning. And in a sense, we have a broader idea of not that we lack meaning, but that we only have meaning in a way that is prepackaged and given to us like children.